Did you know that industrialized countries account for only 12% of the world's population, yet consume over 60% of its resources? The U.S. alone gobbles up a whopping 25% of the energy on Earth. Believe it or not, this shocking disparity is by design. At least that's what my next guest alleges. In describing how this system works, self-titled economic hitman John Perkins says that through the guise of foreign aid, the natural resources of the planet are seized and profits funneled into the pockets of a few. He's also the author of the best-selling book Confessions of an Economic Hitman and Hoodwinked. He joins me now. John Perkins, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Abby. It's great to be with you again.
John, you allege that you were an economic hitman, which you describe as a highly paid professional who cheats countries around the world out of billions of dollars. Are there any government documents that back up this decades-long global conspiracy?
Oh, I think everything that's coming out around the NSA, Edward Snowden's revelations certainly back up an awful lot of it. We're going deeper and deeper into this, so I think at this point there's very little question. Plus, we've admitted to overthrowing governments like Mossadegh in Iran. There's a recent book about the Dulles brothers who were involved in that. We've admitted to overthrowing Arbenz in Guatemala. The CIA did that. In Chile, Allende. Henry Kissinger's admitted to it. Yes, there's a lot of documentation that totally substantiates this.
Your book also claims that so-called jackals are the corporate murderers that have carried out assassinations on world leaders that don't comply with the program, such as the former president of Ecuador. If that's the case, John, why are you alive?
Well, I get that question a lot, Abby, and the reason is I started writing this book in the early 80s. My daughter had just been born. I contacted other people that had been in the business and received threatening phone calls, threatened my life, threatened my young daughter's life. I was also then offered a consulting job with Stone & Webster, a large consulting firm out of Boston and New York. They said I had a great resume, which I did. I'd been chief economist at one of their rivals, and they'd like to use my resume in proposals. They'd like to pay me a very large consultant's fee, about $500,000, just don't write the book. And I wouldn't have to do any work. So here I am in this position where my life and my daughter's life is being threatened. I'm being offered essentially a bribe, but it's a legal bribe. There's nothing illegal about what they did. I took the money, and in my own defense, I have to say that I put it toward good things. I made trips to places, like countries that we were screwing in Latin America, wrote books like Shape-Shifting, The World is As You Dream It. But I didn't expose what was going on. And then after 9/11, I decided I had to come clean. At this point, I decided to write the entire manuscript without telling anybody I was writing it, and then get it out into the hands of major publishers. At that point, it became my best insurance policy. In fact, even today, if someone were to shoot me when I walk out of the studio, the book would sell many, many millions more copies, and that's exactly the opposite of what the jackals would like to have happen. So whistleblowers should never threaten to blow the whistle. They should just get all their ducks in order and then blow the whistle.
Exactly. There are some high-profile deaths of political leaders that have happened here in the U.S., John, that people still question to this day. Do you think that jackals operate inside of America, too?
I have no personal proof of that, but it's sometimes hard to believe that they weren't involved in some of these things. It certainly follows a model that I've seen in many other countries. As I mentioned in my books, I was personally involved with Jaime Roldos, the democratically elected president of Ecuador, and Omar Torrijos of Panama, both of whom were assassinated. And some of the things we've seen in this country are very, very akin to what I've seen overseas. As I said, I personally was never involved. Don't have any personal evidence of that.
Let's talk about Syria. Clearly the goal was regime change, but it didn't happen. Should we expect Assad's plane to crash soon?
I think he's pretty well protected. It's similar to Saddam Hussein, who certainly we tried to win him over using economic hitmen, as we had done in Saudi Arabia very successfully. But Saddam Hussein would not buy in. The jackals tried to take him out. They couldn't. He had very good security. So that's when we sent in the military. I suspect Assad's in a very similar position, that he's probably very well protected. And of course, the fact that Russia is backing Assad in many respects makes that very difficult too. In a place like with Gaddafi in Libya, we have more international support than we do in Syria.
Last time you were on the show, John, you were talking about when the evolution occurred of corporate control pretty much over governments. When and how did that transition take place?
Well, it really started at the end of World War II when the World Bank and the IMF were created at the Bretton Woods Conference. And these were institutions that were created to help reconstruct a devastated Europe. And they did a pretty good job at it. But then very soon after that became this tension between the Soviet Union and the United States, what we know as the Cold War. And then these institutions became very supportive of big corporations because they wanted to prove that capitalism was better than the Soviet system. And so they really bought into the corporate policy, supported big corporations around the world, privatizing things in developing countries, making huge loans to developing countries that they couldn't pay off, so then demanding that they privatize their electric utilities, their water and sewage systems, sell them to our corporations. There was this huge expansion. There was this cozy relationship between these major banks, and then Wall Street got involved, and the corporations. And then, of course, there was détente. But it didn't stop there. The cozy relationship had developed, and it continued and continued to develop. So really, at this point in time, it's safe to say that the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, much of Wall Street, serves essentially as a tool for big corporations. And in fact, so does the U.S. government, so does the Pentagon, so does the NSA, so does the CIA. Very, very much supportive of big corporations. You know, we've seen with these Snowden revelations about the NSA that a lot of their spying was done to help U.S. corporations gain an advantage over others, oil companies and other corporations in different countries.
Right, and one thing that I thought was really fascinating is that you said that the NSA personally vetted you for your job at the strategic consulting firm decades ago. I mean, so obviously you were privy to pretty much the extent of this global spying apparatus far before the leaks came out. And Glenn Greenwald claims that the most damning revelations are yet to come. What else could be worse than we already know, John?
Oh, well, I'm sure it can get an awful lot worse. You know, isn't it interesting how already, you know, Dilma Rousseff, the president of Brazil, has declined to come to the United States and meet with Obama because of spying in her country. And I think there's a backstory to that, too, that most of us haven't heard, and that is that the U.S. supported a very brutal military dictatorship in Brazil back when I was an economic hitman, and Dilma was a resistance fighter. And so she's very sensitive to the idea of the U.S. government spying on her or anybody in her government. We don't hear that very often. And 3 other major countries in Latin America have broken ties with European countries because of this thing over Snowden. So it's become huge, and I think we're going to hear an awful lot more. And yes, I was interviewed by the NSA. I was offered a job at the NSA back when I first got out of business school. They put me through lie detector tests, personality tests, and they determined that I would actually make a pretty good agent.
Do you still have connections to this system? I mean, do you still have ties to any current economic hitman, and have you tried to convince them that they're working for sociopathic plutocrats?
Well, only through my books, Abby. I'm really very much out of the system. I mean, I do run into people from time to time. I go out and have dinner or beers or something with a few guys who are doing this before, or women. So there are connections there, yes. But frankly, at this point in time, my main goal is to create a better world. To expose what happened in the past and to use that as a springboard into moving into a new type of economy, working with corporations to turn them around, to convince them that their main job is to serve a public interest. It's not just to make huge profits for Wall Street and for the 1%, the wealthy, but to actually serve a public interest. The U.S. has a long history of having set that back in the 1800s as a prime goal of corporations. So I see my job today as turning what I would call a death economy, which we have today, one that's based on the military, it's based on ravaging the earth, tearing up resources. Let's turn that around and convince these corporations and pay our taxes to corporations that will, instead of making weapons, help clean up the terrible pollution of the planet, help starving people around the world grow food more efficiently, store it and distribute it more efficiently, create better systems of transportation, energy, marketing, banking, and so on and so forth. I think there's tremendous opportunities here to create a really much better economic world, a life economy instead of a death economy.
I absolutely agree with that, but John, if the third world is in perpetual indentured servitude to the first by design, and the riches of the first world based on the debt of these countries, how can that ever change? We have about a minute left.
Well, yeah. I think it's going to take a real change in consciousness on our part, and that's why I write, that's why I'm on shows like this, that's why you're doing this show. Thank God you are. That's why we're doing what we're doing, because we've got to get people to understand that the real solution to acts of terror around the world is to get rid of the causes of terror, the deep underlying causes, which are desperation, which are poverty, which are people's lands being taken away by oil companies and public utility companies and big multinational corporations. If we want a good world, a sustainable, just, and peaceful world, then we've got to create a new kind of economy around the world. And that is going to take all of us understanding better what's gone on, what we need to do to change it.
It is a revolutionary values of consciousness, of just thought. Thank you for being such an integral part of that. John Perkins, author of Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Hoodwinked. Everyone check it out. Thanks so much for coming on.
My pleasure, Abby. Thank you so much for having me.